Hi there. Another bit of a change in my setup. I got my green screen on behind me today, so I should hopefully have a better transparency uh, calculation as far as my video is concerned. I've also updated where my video is placed on the screen here, so I'm in the upper corner here, um, and it shouldn't overlap. I was just testing with my source code review. I think everything's going to work much better this time. I had some overlapping if you happen to watch last week's video. So anyway, I wanted to kind of cover, it's been a busy week for me this week and a bit of a change of plans early on. I had intended to start work on the calculator app, um, but Wayne over on the Discord asked a question that got me to think, well, maybe I have a simpler project to kind of test my code generation on, and that is reproducing the sort of transpiler type work that I've been doing in Bash script, um, but using Basic09 and trying to create a basic uh, code written utility that I can install in NitroOS 9 and actually do that transpiling inside the Cocoa itself. Um, so, to prepare for that, um, I've been also doing some cleanup, and I'll go into more detail on this in a little bit. But I've been cleaning up my prompts section here. So this is week 3. I added the shell prompt that I used to create the shell awk code for my transpiling using Unix. Um, for week 3, I've added in, actually this one I think I've added it, but I didn't even really get to it. This is the one that I actually used um, in my prompt, and I'll go bring that up as well because that'll be useful to look at. So I gave it my basic reference uh, source code file. So that's, um, let me show you that one. That is this. So this is this document that I've been working on. Although I gave it the one that's actually compiled. Here, I'll scroll down so you can see where it is inside the folder structure under source basic reference.b09. And again, I'll put a link in the description for this GitHub project if you want to take a look at the source yourself. But essentially, there's a transpile version of this that replaces. So the version that you'll find in that source folder has these at type, and I think I've also got down here in the dev name function. Where's that? Da, 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 here it is, dev name. There's also a const, and so just as a quick recap, my build process takes this source files like this, looks for these at type and at const, and also at var, which I added, but I still haven't really incorporated yet, so don't worry too much about that, other than the fact that there are 3 separate config files. So in the same basic source folder, there's a types.b09, which is where I've been declaring all the types inside of my project. So these are types that are referenced by a variety of different source code files, but everything that's processed by the build script when I run the build. There's also a constants.b09 file, which is where I'm doing the same thing for constants. So these are where I'm trying to have hard-coded values. In fact, I don't think these will. I haven't incorporated these anywhere, and I don't think this is legal syntax because I don't think you can dim it and assign it a value in the same line, which is, this is the only one that's actually being replaced right now, and in order to get it to work, I actually have to do both the dim of the ID of the value and the setting of the value in a single line using the new line escape character that basically will now treat this as essentially two code lines, but they're just stored on the same actual line in the file. And then there's a variables one, which again, this is meant to be sort of common use variables that are going to be shared across procedures. So I can sort of declare the structure of it once, and then I'll insert that into each of the different source files. I'll come back to this, how this works and what I'm looking to do to tweak it in the near future, because I just wanted to basically, for the exercise that happened this week, was replicate exactly what the bash file that currently is operating does, which is essentially looks for those type register, const device ID, and then it'll look for register and device ID in these respective things. So it'll look for register here, and it'll look for device ID here, and then it'll take the entire source line in this file where it finds that match and replace the const space device ID string in the sort of the source file with these meta tags, and replace it with this value here. So it essentially would allow me to declare that const device ID and a bunch of different procedures inside the same source file, or even across source files within the project, and it'll always use the same definition. So I just have to change it once here, and then it'll update everywhere. Same thing with type. Especially when types are being passed between procedures, you have to redeclare them in each of the procedures in which they're going to be used, or variables assigned to their type are going to be used. And so, again, another issue where I don't want to have duplication, so I can define it once in this file, and then it'll just go and do the replacements. So the one downside, if you wanted to really do all this work with the Cocoa, is that you can't run this you couldn't run this currently inside of a Cocoa because it was a bash script, and bash is, specific to a Unix, well, at least a POSIX operating system that uses bash as a shell, and that's not NitroOS 9. It has its own shell. So that brought me to the project, which I started on Monday, and I successfully, just as a spoiler, got it all working. And we'll kind of walk through the process of how I did that. So let's start with my prompt. So now, what my approach, I'll have to see if I can't remember where we left things off at the last conversation, last week, but I originally sort of came at this with, can I create a bunch of example code and then a prompt that I can hand to a model, and that model will then satisfy the requirements of the prompt using the example source as sort of the template for how it's supposed to write its code. Again, when you're dealing with large language models, and you're dealing with specifically Basic09, but any sort of retro programming language, this is really relevant to anything that's now considered an obsolete language that's not being used in a professional sense anymore, and that's definitely the case for Basic09. It's a tool for programming for NitroOS 9, and NitroOS 9 is for tinkerers primarily. So what I have modified in the big change that's changed from what I did before, where I was mostly just keeping the prompt to what it is that I wanted, I've now started adding to it some best practices. So both do's and don'ts and general tips. So let's start with the prompt, just to give you an idea of what the task I gave the model was. And that was, I want to write a Basic09 procedure that accepts a source file path string, a target file path string, and a folder path string containing 3 named files. So it's slightly different than the way the bash script works, in that the bash script looks for those 3 template files in the same in the same source folder, so source/basic off of the root of my project. It looks in that basic folder for these files. I changed it for this because I see this as being a potential utility that I'll actually install and can run at the command line in NitroOS 9. So in that case, I wanted to make a couple small additions. Got my chair here, and it's gives me a little bit of balance if I bang into it. what it's going to do is going to let me just say, here's the source file, here's the destination file, and here's the location of where you're going to find the types, the constants, and the variables B09 files. And then if the source file path or target file path is omitted, fail on error. If the folder path is omitted, assume the named files are in the current data directory. So in NitroOS 9, it always has two directories sort of where it's in. There's the data directory and the executable directory, which is PWD and PWX, or CHD, CHX for changing. For PWD, PWX displays the current folder that you're in, the data in the executable folder, and then the CHD and CHX changes that folder to the one that you pass in for the data and executable folder, respectively. So it's just saying that if I don't give it a other folder, it's going to assume whatever the data directory that it's in right now is where those files are located, and if it doesn't find them, it should fail an error. This procedure should read each line in sequence from the source and look for one of the following tokens: @@type, @@const, and @@var. If found, skipping the following whitespace and taking the string result of alphabetic, so upper and lowercase, plus underscore, and trailing string characters for constants and variables as the name of the type. And really, it should be alphanumeric, but for simplicity for right now, anyway, that's where it's at. Because you can have any alphanumeric character, but this can't start with a number. Same, and this is common in most programming languages. But anyway. Okay, so as the name, so it should grab the name after the @@type or @@const or @@var and use that as the name of the token that it's looking for. And there should be nothing but whitespace following the name on the source line. So again, so this is very rudimentary and only kind of allows you to do full line replacements based on, and it's expecting the @@type or const or var to be the first non-whitespace text on that line. And it's going to preserve all the white space to the left of the @@type just to allow for indentation. And then it should just replace whatever it finds with that line, either in the types file, the const file, or the var file. Oh, interesting, I did an error here in my prompt, but that's okay. That should be const. Like that. Oh, I can't change it because I've already, okay, anyway, that should be constants. And then, I say preserve leading whitespace on the source line when writing to the output file. So here's the example. So if you're looking for a type, it'll look in the types.file and give you that. If it looks for a const, it'll, so, oh, I just did a copy. I didn't actually change that one. That should be a const, my type, and then it should look in constants.bo9 and find a dim statement. And then if it's an @@var, this is where it's going to be looking for it, and then the output follows that. So a little messy here and a little wrong. Like I said, this is just a duplicate of this one. It should be the constants example, but that's okay. And then I copied in this. Here's a list of do's, don'ts, and general tips for writing Basic09 code. Now, if I go to my project, so the retro MAME developer, if you go to NitroOS 9 examples, which is where all of this code is housed, and go to source, under prompts, and again, I was talking about, oh, I haven't checked in week 1. Anyway, I've got week 2 and week 3 for the prompts that are specific to this exercise, for what I did in this week. You will find those in, so any of the prompts in here, so the process file macros should be a copy of what I'm just showing you now. There's also an update transpiler one. I actually should take that out because I didn't, this was something that I started working on, but then I quickly abandoned it, so don't worry about that one. But so the process files macro, so this is basically the exact same thing, although, oh, I did fix it for this, interestingly enough. I must have spotted my error and then updated it here. So this is not exactly what I sent it, but it's close enough to the original doc that I gave the model to generate my source code. I will come back to the updated transpiler as we get to that next part of the process later on in the week, but I want to highlight here, inside the root prompts folder, there's a best practices.md, and this one is always going to be up to date. So this is my current list of do's, don'ts, and general tips for writing Basic09 code. And much of this has been, you're going to notice that this is quite different than what was put in that original prompt. It's at least double the length. Because a lot of these are things that I learned to add as part of discovering the sort of common mistakes that the model would make on my original prompt. So again, so here I have some stuff, and where I got this original do's and don'ts is what I gave Gemini my markdown version of that microware Basic09 reference manual. Just the basic parts, and not the editor and the debugger and the appendices and all that sort of stuff. So just the chapters that deal with this is the basic language and how you use it and sort of best practices and all that sort of stuff. And I said, pull me out a list from this, the do's and don'ts, as well as general tips. So most of what's here in this initial prompt was all AI generated, and most of it's good. There's a few in here. Let me see, what was one that I pulled out? Oh, this one here. This was, I'm not sure exactly where this came from. I'm not even sure if it's accurate. I did get that conversation to show me the links to the file, so that I could sort of correlate and make sure that what it's saying actually was said in the manual. I haven't gotten a chance to go back to that, just like I said, because I started this going down one path this week, and then I quickly switched over to this Basic09 based transpiler version of the bash script. So this is one of those things that I'll have to, loose threads I'll have to come back and sort of look at. But in either case, because it certainly wasn't necessary for the work that I was doing for this week's exercise, it got pulled out. Like I said, if I can find my best practices here is meant to be a living document, so I'm going to add and manipulate and make changes to this over the coming weeks as I learn more about what are successful instructions that I hand to the model that gets me more accurate and better written Basic09 code. Okay, so just giving this sort of really light in the detail, we did kind of describe the overall, what I'm expecting to give it as an input and what I'm expecting as an output, especially giving it templates of how this process is supposed to work. And like I said, giving it sort of that initial set of do's and don'ts and tips. I got something that, one, definitely didn't work right out of the box. But now, having gotten to the end of the week and have a successful version of this code running, it turns out that there were a couple of predictable errors that it made. And I've gotten a lot better at communicating the results that I'm looking for, as a result of it not giving me exactly what I wanted when I gave it this first prompt. Oh, it's interesting. Oh, so that's why it looks like that. Because I actually stopped it on that first pass, and then I went back and made changes because I recognized that I did make the const problem. I did not fill that out. So I made a couple of revisions to the prompt. Oh, so this might actually be the version that you see over here in my prompts week 3. So this is probably that second stab at that prompt, is from this file here. Okay, back to the browser. So then okay, so then it gave me my process files macros, very wordy name. I eventually switched this name down to Transpiler, which is the version of the procedure that you'll find now on my GitHub project and inside of a file called transpile.b09 in the source basic folder. Let me just quickly skim through this. Yeah, so then after I got its initial output, I did a read through and I started trying to get it to compile inside of the Cocoa environment, and I came up with a couple of obvious ones. One was it really had a problem with the end of line comment syntax where you have to do a forward slash, which indicates this is now starting a new line of code, but Basic09 allows you to essentially have multiple lines of code on the same actual file line as long as you have a backslash separating each of the different lines. Again, I'm trying to discourage that in general, but for end of line comments in particular, I'm allowing this syntax of putting the backslash and then a exclamation point to say this is a comment. And it was ignoring that backslash. Then the other thing it did is that it invented 3 reserved words that Basic09 does not support. And that's const, switch, and case. And it did come up with a couple others. Else if is another one, like all one word. It tried to use that as a constant, as a reserved word. And so again, kind of common mistakes that Basic09 of a model has when trying to write specifically an old language like Basic09 is that, especially with Basic, there are so many much more successful, much more current versions of Basic out there, especially from the Microsoft side of things, that the models know very, very well. And those languages do have terms like a const or a switch or a case. And there is no type of a switch type of logic, a pure switch case logic structure or block structure inside of Basic09. You have to use if, then, else, if, then, else, if, then, and even that's a little bit, it doesn't even allow for if, else blocks. You can only have an if, then, else, and that's the end of your else. You can have you can handle the condition where the if is true or where it's false. If you want to have sort of a if this then this, or if this then this, or this then this, like a switch statement where you want to have multiple conditions in multiple branches, you have to nest the if statements inside of them, and the model has a real difficulty with that without proper examples. So those were a couple of the big ones. Let me see. So then did another code generation. Oh, I said you can't do a break. That was another thing it tried to do. So it had like a loop and then tried to use break to get out of it, and you can't do that. So it fixed that. It still was having problems at the end of line. And it also wasn't doing any logging. That's something else that I added into my best practices as we went. Then, but that's kind of my first go by. So let me go over my best practices, because I think this is the best way to kind of review the overall current state of where I'm at, as well as I'll relay back some of these to some of the troubleshooting that I was having when I was getting this code running. So, do's and don'ts. Don't make changes that are unnecessary. This is a GitHub managed project, so source changes and code check-ins should be targeted to solving given tasks only. This particular line is to try and prevent the model from making generally this is a general practice I found with model code of any sort, is that you don't want to hand it a big large block of code when all you really want is it, and then you want it to regurgitate back that full block of code with only the changes you want it to make, because one of the things that the model tends to do is change things like comments in comment lines or rename variables, and it will do that unprompted. So that's what this line is trying to solve, is to prevent that tendency. Do not use structured programming do use structured programming techniques. So large complex problems are easier to develop, test, and maintain when they are divided into multiple procedures, each with a specific function. I don't know that I've had any sort of provable results that show that this is working yet, because the prompt that I gave it was to write everything in a single procedure. That'll be sort of something that I might test more next week. Do use the : equals assignment operator. So this is more of some of these are best practices that are best practices in general for writing Basic09, and a couple of these, or some intricacies of a couple of these, are more about my personal style. This is one of those personal style ones. I'm trying to get code generated that is very readable and useful as a teachable source code. So not just for models, but also for humans. But anybody who's looking at the source code, I want it to be fairly easy to read. I want it to be, so that means it's going to have more white space than is strictly necessary. When you bring this into the Basic09 environment, it'll strip out a lot of white space just because it is unnecessary. But for readability, things like a colon equals instead of equals, you can use either to assign a value to a variable. Colon equals, though, is very clear in that you can also reuse equals, just a simple equals, as your logical compare in an if statement, for example. So by always using colon equals when you're assigning values, you make it clear both to the model and to the user reading the code that this is an assignment, and it makes it a little more robust. Same thing with this next line. Do declare variables with type, param, and dim at the start of the procedure. While not mandatory, this practice improves program readability. Oh, sorry, that's not the one I'm thinking of. There is a further line down here later on related to that. Yeah, here we go. Procedure header order. So the order of declarations at the top of a procedure is strict. This is the one that's part true, part personal choice. Type statements do need to come before anything that's using, so any param or dim that's going to be of a type of that type needs to have the type declaration above it. So that's, even this isn't necessarily strictly true, but just as for my own purposes of having my code be consistent and for readability, I like having, type is there because it has to be, if you're going to use a type, it has to come first. Param for me, I want second because, again, I want to look at the header of the procedure and know what its inputs are clearly, and having those at the top, kind of like if you in a different programming language where you can actually declare your parameters as part of your procedure line, where you have like a parentheses, like an open parentheses after the procedure name, and then you can list your variables and their types in sort of comma separated syntax, and then a closing parentheses. You don't have that in Basic09. Instead, you declare them as param on separate lines for each parameter, what its name is and what its type is. So that's, again, this is a personal preference partially, but it will make for readable code. So if you want this in a different order, or feel free to make changes to this if you plan to use this yourself, but I just wanted to make that clear. Do initialize variables. So Basic09 does not automatically initialize variables, so they will contain random values when a procedure is run. Your program must assign initial values if needed. So again, not a have to do, but for clarity and just prevention of unintended bugs, it's a good best practice, and that's why it's in here. Do use parentheses to override operator precedence. So again, this is one that I'm not even sure if I do need this. Certainly it didn't seem to come into play in this particular exercise this week, but it is a good best practice, and I don't think it's doing any harm either, so it's just good. Like I said, I think the models, even the trained on more modern languages, I think they'd still kind of understand this, because this is pretty fundamental to programming languages. But anyway, it doesn't hurt to have it in there. Don't use line numbers unless necessary. So using line numbers with statements like go sub is acceptable, but they make programs harder to understand and increase compile time. Definitely can make the programs harder to understand. I'm not sure if it increases compile time. I did have another thing. This was partly AI generated, but I think it would slightly increase compile time. It's more about the harder to understand and readability. And then line numbers must increase in value within a procedure's listing, but separate procedures' line numbering is independent of one another. Again, just another little bit of fact that, especially because line numbers are a pretty old school way of writing code, you don't deal with line numbers in most modern languages. just good to have some clarity of exactly how they're intended to be used, and how you're supposed to be setting line number values inside of procedures. Don't write more than one program statement on a single line. The use of the backslash character to separate statements on one line is not recommended because it hides the program structure and offers no speed advantages. There are exceptions, such as the switch logic example below. So this is down at the bottom here. This is where I think I just briefly touched on it. Instead of doing switch or case or else if, you have to write this pattern where you have if condition 1, then do stuff here. Else if condition 2, then do stuff here. But again, even this is not a true else if. It's treating this if, else, end if as a single block, and then this is actually, to Basic09, a nested if statement inside of it. So if, else, and then end if here. And then inside of this else, there's another nested if, then, else, and that is terminated. Well, technically, this one's terminated by this end if, and this if is terminated by this end if, and this if is terminated by this end if. But you need to have, as many else ifs, so essentially as many ifs as there are inside of your if else if loop or block, you need to have a terminating end if in order for it to be proper Basic09. So that was one that I definitely had to get pretty explicit and add in some sample code to get it to really understand that rule. And even still, I think I have still found it not always understanding this, and I do talk about the if statement specifically. We'll come back to that. Because, I'll come back to that. Don't write more than one program statement on a single line. Okay, I covered that. Do not use end-of-line comments if clarifying. Do use end-of-line comments if clarifying. So this is one of those exceptions where I'm allowing for multiple lines. End-of-line comments are allowed using the syntax of / space apostrophe space and then your comment text. It's not legally used apostrophe or exclamation mark on any line or after non-white space characters. The / symbol indicates to the loader that a new line is starting, thus allowing a new expression such as a comment example. So again, more clarification on this, because it took me a few passes for it to start putting in that / and handling in all situations. Sometimes it did get it right on a couple passes, and then other lines it would forget it. So this current version though, I think it's actually doing it 100% of the time or close to it right now anyway. So that seems to be working for me. Do keep line length to 128 characters. Now this is another one that's a personal choice. I think 128 is the number. I haven't actually gone and tested to verify myself, but I believe Basic09 can handle a line length to almost twice that, maybe. It's certainly over 200 characters, I think. Maybe 256. But where it starts to come into issue is if you're editing or listing the lines inside of the Basic09 editor itself. It can have difficulties in displaying a line once it gets below a certain length, and I think it almost becomes impossible to edit inside of the editor if it can't display all the characters properly. Again, I haven't actually this is just something I heard from Wayne on the Discord group. I haven't gotten a chance to that. Maybe I'll do some time kind of digging into that a little more, but for safety's sake, 128 characters seems to be more than enough for most of the lines, and it doesn't seem to cause any issues. So that's why that's there. Again, not a strict need to have, but it seems to keep the code within the parameters that I want. Do use proper termination. This is a good one. All logic blocks must be terminated properly with the corresponding closing statements. This is another area where Basic09 is different than a lot of other basics. Especially in the way that an end if. Some languages like, say, Python has an end if where it's actually fi. It's just the letters for their closing blocks are like the opening block with the letters reversed. But anyway, so that's what I've done. So if then has to be terminated with end if. While do has to be terminated with end while. For has to be terminated with next. Repeat has to be terminated with until. Loop with end loop. Exit if and end exit. use, without putting that in, it wasn't always getting those proper end terms for some of these. And while was one, I think, and I think even end if it was having problems with. Do not use explicit nested end if statements if else if logic for if else logic. I should tweet that. Each else if is translated to a nested if block requiring a corresponding end if for proper termination. This can be written on a single line for brevity, such as end if / end if. So this is the other specific example where I'm allowing it to use that multiple lines on the same text line syntax. The total number of end if statements must exactly match the number of if statements in the block. And again, I point to that switch logic for an example. Don't use return to terminate a procedure. Return, and this is another one that I tried to use. I tried to use return, tried to use call. So these next two lines are another things where the Gemini model thought that these were legal reserved words in Basic09, and they're not. So it tried to return from a procedure. Can't do that. You can only do end. So return's only valid in returning from a go subroutine. So a procedure is terminated by the end keyword. And then don't use call to run a procedure. The correct keyword for executing a procedure is run. Don't use special symbols for pass by reference. This is another one that I added in just because I was telling it that some of these parameters that I was giving it are passed by reference, and then it invented this @ symbol in front of the parameter name where it was declared as some, I'm guessing that is a valid syntax in some other basic language. Like I said, it interrupted it, it inserted it without prompting, and I only discovered it when it started causing compile issues. So this is what this line is for, which is all parameters are passed by reference by default. So it's kind of also gives some context, because that's definitely not the case for a lot of languages. Usually a parameter is passed by value by default, and you have to explicitly pass it by reference in order to have the value that you pass it when it's changed inside the procedure to be reflected in the calling procedure. But again, like I said, in Basic09, everything's passed by reference. So anything you pass into a procedure can be modified by that procedure, and you will see those changes when you get returned back, when you get popped back onto the call stack, off the call stack. So again, just a little bit of I also say that you can force a pass by value behavior. So if you don't want to pass by reference, you reevaluate the variable at the runtime statement. So, and here's the example. So if you run proc, you put my variable +0, so it won't change the value, so they say that this is an integer variable. If you add 0 to it, you're not changing the value, but the result of that operation is a completely different referenced variable that gets passed into the procedure. Your myvar doesn't get changed. So essentially that allows you to pass by value. It's a bit of a hack, but that's how Basic09 does it. Do not use goto or gosub to jump between procedures. This is another one that, again, I had the model, once I started trying to get it to refactor and move some of the code from, because essentially we're doing pretty much the exact same action with slight variations of reading the types file, pulling out all the lines of type and matching them to a type token, the name of the type itself. It does the exact same thing for consts, and it does the same thing for vars, where it will create essentially, the original code created a table of the tokens and then a matching table with the same array size and the same order of the replacement line, so that when it would match on the token value name, like the name of the token, in the source file, and then find the matching entry in the line replacement array for that token, and then put that into the source, into the target source output. So yeah, line labels and line numbers are local to the procedure in which they're defined. So again, you can't jump to a line number that's in another procedure. So to pass control to the calling procedure's error handler, you actually would raise the error with your error code. And this, I'm just using the same error code. So inside of, maybe I have a procedure, and I'll show you in the final code. My low definitions procedure has its own internal error handling that it'll do a couple of things, maybe just do a little logging, and then it raises that error, and then that gets booted out to the Transpile parent procedure, the main procedure that runs, and it'll do the error handling to sort of exit out and clean things up properly. Do not use labels in on-go-to or on-go-sub statements. So this is another one where, and this is specifically the one that I got, it can only pass, so on error or on whatever evaluation can be a variable or an expression, but it's the values, the where you're going to, that has to be a line number. You can't have a token like low def error, and Basic09 isn't going to understand what that. It'll come up with a syntax error essentially. This might be one of those things that I add into my transpiler to allow for defining of labels, and then it'll just replace that when it does the transpile with the line number. But we'll come back to that when I talk about next steps. Do not use misspelled keywords. Ensure all reserved words are spelled correctly. So this one came in late in my process this week, because I was getting it, once I'd sort of told it those aren't reserved words, you got to use these reserved words. I had one pass where everything looked great, except for some reason, instead of one of the end whiles, which it had been reproducing that same line as end while multiple times, it came up with end whale. I don't know where that came from. But so that's where I'd end of, like I said, I just tried to put a line in here to have it make sure that it doesn't, again, this is just a random token generation, and for some reason it thought ALE and not ILE when it generated that token, I guess. So anyway, that is what I'm not confident that that's going to solve my problem. I am still keeping an eye out for misspelled reserved words, to see if that happens again. It was it only happened one time. It was a really weird, one-off, but that's kind of part of, I don't know if it's, at least with the way that the models are trained now, I don't know, at least with this current process, whether I'll ever get 100% all the time accurate code, but that's kind of what little edge case lines like this are meant to handle, or these lines are meant to handle. So like those weird edge case where for some reason the model burped up an incorrect reserved word. This one here is my last catch-all inside the do's and don'ts, which I've had the model try and rephrase it a couple times as I've been revising it. But it is, don't assume you know how to write Basic09 code. And again, this is specifically for LLMs. LLMs are trained on many basic language variants that are not Basic09. Basic09 has language restrictions that newer languages have created solutions for, and you were trained on them. If you don't see the name of the target language keyword or specific programming pattern in the provided reference code, ask for clarification. That particular instruction, I don't think I've ever seen it do, so again, I'm not sure how relevant that particular sentence is, but the absence of a feature in the reference code is a strong indicator that it may not be supported or may have different syntax in Basic09. Before providing the final code, review it to ensure that all syntax and patterns used were either explicitly requested or demonstrated in the provided source code and tips. So again, that's kind of my last catch-all do and don't, to try to encourage it to, again, I'm sort of describing a thought process that doesn't actually happen, but because models tend to work well if you treat them as if they're a human, I do find that I get some success with this type of instruction. Like I said, it's not actually going to, as it's generating the code, it's not, at least I haven't found a way for it to specifically work in a way that it is actually, oh, that token's not right, I need to change it. Once the code line is written, I haven't been able to successfully get a model in the same prompt response to follow up and say, oh, I think there's something wrong with that, or I think there's something wrong with that. Part of my hope for this paragraph is, even if it's not working the way that I'm trying to tell it to work, I think by having this sort of an explanation of what it is that I'm thinking and what I want as a result may increase the odds of getting those results, even though that's not how the model works. It's model work. Trying to understand how a model thinks is confusing because like I said, it's really just a token generator. It's not actually doing thought process behind this, but it looks like a thought process as far as the results of what we get from it. Anyway, so that's my best stab at trying to solve that problem, where it keeps inventing things that don't exist in the Basic09 language. Okay, and then finally, I came up with a number of general tips that either just didn't fit within a do and don't format, or the model generated some of these, especially some of the early ones. I generated them from the basic manual. String variable declarations. When you do declare a string variable with a $sign suffix and without specifying maximum length, the default length is 32 characters. To declare a string with a different length, use the dim statement with a maximum length. For example, dim name string 40 for a 40 character string. Variables with a $suffix, for example, title $, or automatically assign the default string type. So, just a kind of a best practice as far as the way strings are declared, all concisely done within a couple of lines. Automatic type conversions. Basic09 automatically converts numeric data types, so byte, integer, or real, to the largest type necessary to retain accuracy in expressions. However, these conversions take time, so it's more efficient to use expressions where all values are of a single type wherever possible. So again, that one I think I've gotten successful results from. Choosing numeric data types. Using integer or byte whenever possible, as arithmetic operations with these types are much faster and require less storage than real values. Real is the default type for undeclared variables. So again, another good piece of niceness that you wouldn't necessarily get from code samples saying use integer and byte, and the default in particular, if you don't specify what the type the variable is, it's going to default to real. Well, this has got the $, suffix. Variable storage. All variables are local to the procedure where they are defined. Their storage is allocated when the procedure is called and is lost when the procedure is executed. They can be passed by reference as parameters to other procedures. Again, kind of covering a little bit of similar ground with the reference as parameters. But again, this is another thing that one of the things that it often tries to do is generate variables or comment lines or type declarations outside of a procedure block. Outside of, and everything needs to be between the procedure line and an end line, essentially, inside of your Basic09 source. So that's trying to help solve that problem. This one came late, as I worked through the file I/O for this exercise. I got it to generate something that kind of blocks out best practices for doing file input-output. So any procedure performing file I/O should be designed for robustness. This means it should always check if a file exists before attempting to open it for reading to avoid unexpected errors. It should use Boolean flags to track the open-close status of each file handle. It's critical for ensuring that they're always closed properly, even in the event of a runtime error. Error handling, so we want to implement on-error go-to logic to catch common I/O errors like file not found and other system errors. I haven't actually verified that error 210 is file not found, but I'll do that this week as well. The error handler should provide a clear and descriptive message to the user indicating the specific problem and the file involved. Just nice little clear descriptive. And then resource manager. Ensure all open files are closed via close statements in a dedicated block of code, typically within the main procedure's error handler. This prevents file handles from being left open, which can lead to system level issues or data corruption. And then logging. This is another late add because I didn't have this in my initial best practices. Does it include print statements or a logging mechanism to provide clear progress updates and confirm successful operations to the user? This helps with debugging and gives the user confidence that the program is working as expected. For example, and then I added in a block from something pretty similar to what's inside the source code that we're going to get to in a minute. Just essentially having a flag to say if we want verbose logging, and then we'll print that out. And so I'm just trying to pass that on as a best practice for new code that gets generated. Variable and type name uniqueness. All variable names and type names, so type attribute names, must be unique within a program, or at least within a procedure. I don't know if program's right. to avoid duplicate definition errors. This is why using descriptive names, even for counters, is important. I may tweak the language of that a little bit because, like I said, I think that's more true within a procedure, and I should say type attribute names. Variable naming convention. Use descriptive variable names that are generally under 10 characters. This improves readability while adhering to the common length limitations of Basic09's line editor. This is one that I added after the fact. I haven't actually tested it yet, but just as an observation of the code that we're going to look at in a little bit here, there are a lot of longer than 10 character variable names. So I do want, again, because I want this to be educational and you know, code that can train somebody in how to write better code. I do tend to prefer longer variable names within reason, and I should also add in something about procedure names too on that line. Anyway, type variable parameter declarations. When a type variable is passed as a parameter to a procedure, its type must be declared at the top of both the calling and called procedures. This ensures the procedure correctly interprets the structure of the incoming data. Again, another thing that I had where I passed a variable of a type into a function, and then it didn't generate the type inside that function. So that's what that line is supposed to solve. Procedure header order. This is the one we already just covered about type coming first, then param, then dim. And then finally, switch logic. So switch case or else if are not reserved words in BASIC. This has to be written in this structure. And again, I've already kind of covered this, but that's how you do a switch statement in BASIC. Okay, let's go to the BASIC now. So if you go into the BASIC folder and go to transpile.b09, you'll see the latest version of the code as I got this all working. If I go and view the history on this, let's start here. Oh, right. Actually, let's start here. So my first commit was this, which is what I basically got a pure copy of what it generated. And like I said, it called it process file macros to start. This got cumbersome typing in, so I ended up renaming it to Transpile because it's a lot shorter. And it doesn't have the underscores. Underscores are painful character to type in and on the Cocoa because it's not on the keyboard. You have to use I think it's a Alt dash is the key combo for it, but it's not obvious. It's not. You don't see that on the keyboard. So I think I'm going to steer away from using underscores in names in the future. But in either case, I have been kind of. This is another one of those naming conventions that I've kind of invented as I've been going along here, and that is where I've got my procedure that is runnable, I'm putting in all caps, whereas supporting procedures, like eventually, if I go back here to my final version of this source, is it going back? No, back's not working for some reason. Back, weird. So yeah, in the final version of this, I have a load definitions procedure, which is called down here in the transpile 3 times here. So it's calling run load definitions. So that's been sort of my default naming convention, where procedures that are not entry procedures are doing camel case with capital at the start. Same thing with types. I'm doing the same sort of naming convention, but I've been reserving for the ones that are an executable procedure. I've been making them all caps just to sort of differentiate them when you see them in the list of procedures inside of a source file. And that's just something I've invented myself. There's no reason why anybody else has to follow that, but that's just kind of what I've been landing on. And I might tweak that as I go, but just for some clarity. Okay, so when I first started, I did some changes here, and let me go back. And then I made a few changes as I was kind of working through, like I said, invalid switch case. I incorporated some model changes. So I got rid of the break. Oh yeah, another thing that I discovered as I was going, let's see, where is this? Yeah. So I had this max definitions constant, um, and I meant this. Oh, actually, you know what? That's not right. I gotta change that. I'll make a note of that when I finish to change that. It should be 50. But effectively, what I was trying to do is I wanted to put this max definitions inside of here because I actually had 6 arrays on the original source code. If I go back here and look at the original part, so you'll see it has. So I replaced type names and type contents, const names and const constants, var names and var contents. Sorry. So there were 2 arrays for both for types, constants, and variables. One stored the token, so the name of the type, or the name of the constant, or the name of the variable, and the other one stored the string replacement, so that if you find that token in the source code, it'll replace that line with whatever it finds at the same index in type contents. So the end version of this code, I moved that into a type here called template, which has a token type byte. So that's either 0 for type, 1 for constant, and 2 for var. Type name, which is the actual token to be replaced, the name of the type or the constant or the variable, and then this is the type content is the actual replacement string. So now there's a single type, and the value that we're passing is a array of that template instead of, like I said, I was juggling 6 arrays in this original source code. So that was one of the big clarifications that we did. Once we got the code working, I did some manual refactoring with a bit of an assistance from the model. But that's kind of the difference between beginning of the week and end of the week. That's one of the big changes. So then, let's just kind of walk through roughly what this code did originally. Like I said, it did it all in one single procedure. The first thing it would do is declare all of our variables that we need for running this code, and then set some initial variables and constants, so flags, that sort of stuff. Set up the error handling so that it would go to line 900, which is way down at the bottom here, at the very end of the file. Line 900 is where it handled any sort of, it would close files that were open. I guess it checks to see if the file is open. If it does, it closes it, and it logs out a processing error. Then it does some tests to make sure that the target file name is passed in correctly, the source file name is passed in correctly. It does some testing on the folder path, although again, I don't think this is fully hardened. But as long as you're giving it correct values, it does work. I guess I haven't. There's still some hardening that can be done and some efficiencies that can be found, but this is where I got to at the end of this week anyway. Then it goes into the types.bo9 file, locates the file, and then handles some local error handling so that it can handle some edge cases again. The error handling, don't worry about the error handling. It's still not fully tweaked, but even in the final version, it's got some issues. But we're just kind of reading over the code here. Then it opens up the file, sets the flag to true, and then until it runs to the end of the file, it goes and adds to the definition. So unless we hit the max definition limit. The original source code set all of these to 50. Again, so this is wrong. This is what it did originally. But then when I fixed it and hard coded in the number 50, I ran out of memory error. So 50 of 6 different arrays of those string lengths was more than the 32 maximum K of data structure memory or data memory essentially that you have accessible inside of Basic09. So for testing purposes, I dropped that down to 10 for each of them. In the end result, like I said, I merged because there was so much, especially, it went and did the logic for the types file and the logic for the constants file and the logic for the variables file. These blocks of code, we've got quite a few dozen lines here, are almost all exactly the same with a few string differences in some of this logic here, that sort of thing. So that's where I refactored after I got it ringing. So I was more focused with trying to get the code to work to start rather than making it pretty or making it efficient. and that we got running Tuesday or Wednesday, I think. Something around there where I finally got the code to actually compile and fixed all of the syntax errors and that sort of thing. And the only other thing that it really had an issue with was, I think, maybe one of these error codes it got wrong. It was looking for something. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. After we've read in all three definitions files, and we've created our arrays of token and string replacement lines, we get to the main processing loop. So here, we open up the source file, we open up the target file to write, and there wasn't error handling here. There is some error handling we threw in later on to sort of, if the file already exists, we delete it, and then we create the new file. And this was to deal with another Basic09 weirdness that I learned, which is if you open a file that already exists and you write over that contents with less content than what the original file size was defined, it'll essentially leave garbage in the rest of the file, and the file stays at the original size as opposed to reshaping itself to fit yours. Now, if you give it more data than the original file was, it will extend the size of the file to fit. It just doesn't do the shrink down by default. That's why you have to do the delete. So that's another best practice for specific to Basic09 that will need to be handled by my instructions going forward. Okay, so then once we got the two files open, we then read in from the source files line at a time. If it finds a token, it does a search to see if it can find the @@, and if the @@ matches type or const or var, it then goes and looks up that definition and swaps out the line. Otherwise, it just takes the source line and spits it out to the target. And that's effectively the rest of the logic of this, and then there's just cleanup and error handling. So it's a pretty simple procedure, and like I said, I didn't get working code off the get-go, and there were some obvious errors that it made that because I didn't give it clear enough or more detailed enough explanation of how you write Basic09 code successfully. But it was pretty darn close. I'd say 80 to 90% correct, and the errors that were there were mostly the same error multiple times, like the not having that backslash before putting an end of line comment happened a dozen times in the file. Same thing with a couple of the other mistakes that it made. They were just the same mistake multiple times. Once I cleaned all those up and got it to write a little bit of proper Basic09 code when it tried to do things like that switch block, everything worked. Very surprising, and happily surprised. So then, once we got it working, I did have another conversation here. Let me get to the top. Ooh, a long conversation. All right. So now I gave it my current source code, and I said I'm running a Basic09 procedure that accepts a source file path, a target file path string. So this is basically the same cut and paste from the original prompt. In addition to that, this is the new part here, where I'm saying I'm attaching the source to the latest version of this code. These are our tasks to complete sequentially. We want to change the definitions logic to use a 50 size array of the template type instead of the 3 pairs of arrays, so type names, type contents, const names, const contents, var names, var contents, resulting in one array of all definitions. The main file processing loop should then use this array when looking for token replacements, filtering based on the token type value of each record in the array. So 0 is type, 1 is const, 2 is var, according to the found token type in token $. So token $, is this variable that it pulls from the source file line that it finds the @@ type, @@ const, @@ var. Token is the string that comes to the right of it after white space. That is the name of the type, constant, or variable. Then extract a new universal procedure that loads a target definitions file and adds found records, so types, constants, or variables, to the definitions array according to the given matching and processing logic as parameters. Update the load types, constants, and variables blocks to call this procedure, passing in the differences between them to this universal procedure. Maintain the file main file processing loop logic, looking for more efficient ways of performing the same work of the token replacement. Look for code redundancy to suggest new procedures, replacement logic for the extracted code. Reading from the three types, constants and variable files logic, and the use of these data structures throughout the program are key targets. So I just kind of try to push in the direction where I wanted it to focus, is looking for redundancies and enhancements. And then, just as a blanket at the end, identify other targets for streamlining, suggesting improvements for each target individually. I often kind of throw in you tell me what you think is missing if it's something I haven't said, or some variation of that at the end of a lot of prompts, simply because I'm not, I'm human. I've overlooked something fairly obvious. So giving an instruction like this at the end of a set of instructions can often help it surface things that maybe I didn't think about. And then I gave it the same, so token replacement example is exactly the same as the original prompt. This updated list of do's, don'ts, and general tips is not the same. I'm pretty sure that's new. So I did add in some more of the best practices, all the best practices that I developed as I was cleaning up the original source code and fixing the errors that it gave and making changes until I got a working procedure. That's what this is. Now, since then, I've also added more best practices to that document. So again, this is also not going to be an exact one-for-one of what you'll find in this best practices thing, but it should be, this update transpiler should be the exact copy of what you'll see in this conversation here. So that should be this value here. Plus, like I said, I just uploaded Transpile as a source file. The only other thing to note here, the reason why it's a .txt file is because I want it to recognize it as a text file. When you upload files to most of these models, I think I can upload it like a .b09 file to Gemini, although I don't know how it's going to interpret it, because that B09 extension is just, again, is another sort of convention I've at least made up myself, but it's just the shortening of the name Basic09 makes it obvious that it's for Basic09. I am not using .bas, for example, as my extension, because BS just indicates basic, and there's so many variants of basic, it's not as specific as using B09. So, but like I said, I just don't send it up to the Gemini as a B09 file just because I wanted to treat it as a text file. It might think of it as a binary or something, or it might just ignore it altogether if it doesn't recognize the extension. So that's specifically why it's .txt. Okay, so then I passed that in, and this is where it did my so to streamline Transpile procedure, we'll refactor the code, use a single data structure for definitions and a universal procedure for loading definition files. So it gave me a code snippet, and again, it tried to put in max definitions, which it can't do. That's not legal. Down here, it added this local key name, which you pulled out of thin air. It also tried to pass your parameters using something that is like a much more modern way of declaring parameters for a procedure. And what else did it do that I can remember? It may have gotten one of the end diffs wrong on one of these. I think was the other thing that it did. Maybe it was the first block. No. Anyway, there was an if issue as well, I think. Oh, and here's the other one. This low def error. This is where it came up with that labeling. So, I gave it a response. So I said, you violated the don't assume you know how to write Basic09 rule that I tried to establish in my instructions. Here are the errors. You cannot use a variable in dim statements. All variables must be literals. This type of line is what I'm referring to, and I gave it a quote from its sample up above. So it can't use max definitions. Procedure declarations should have very specific syntax as demonstrated in my previously attached source code. Plus, local is not a reserved word in Basic. So I gave an example. I took what it did, and then I gave an example of what it's supposed to look like. And so local should be dim. And then the procedure header for all these params should be separate lines, param, type, and value. If else blocks do not technically allow for else space if. Oh, there's an else is up there somewhere too. So Basic09 will take an else if line as valid input, but it converts it to a nested if statement inside the default else block. So this is where I started coming up with that best practice line that's in there now. So you need to include an additional /end if on the terminating end if line for every nested if block. For example, so here's switch logic general tip. You need to have end if because it's if, so there needs to be 3 end ifs. Procedure blocks are always terminated with end statements. So end proc, oh, there's another reserved word that it had. It is not a reserved word, basically. A procedure with no error handling should only have one end declaration. I don't know if that's precisely true, but it's a good best practice. I think that's why I said should. Block of code targeted by an on error call should also terminate with an end statement unless the error logic is supposed to resume code execution afterward. First provided, and then I asked you to provide some new do's and don'ts for future conversations to express these. So that's where the text came for these ones that I put in. I mostly took what it gave. I may have made some slight modifications, but again, in the interest of getting the model to do as much work as possible, I asked it to give me some updated do's, don'ts, and general tips for what I just described, and then suggest an update to my don't assume you know how to write Basic09 code tip specifically so that it can flag some of these changes early on. Because again, it should. I would like it when it does something like this, where it tries to insert nproc, and nproc's not a proper term, to at least point that out after it's generated its code to say, hey, I didn't find this somewhere. I still haven't gotten it to do that, and like I said, I'm probably have to tweak my instructions to maybe get it to do something like that, or maybe I have to add in a full list of reserved words in Basic09 and tell it as an instruction, if you try and use a term that is not in this list, that's an error. I don't know. I'll play with it some more this week, but it's my first stab. And then update your code snips. So here's my 2 new do's and don'ts. So I think I added most of those in. And then here's a clarified version. I don't even think this is the final version because I think I got it to do it again later on. And then it gave me updated code snippets. So here you can see it fixed the 50 here. Here it did the parametering and the dimming and everything proper. It got rid of that else space if that would have been there originally, wherever it was. So I think it did pretty well, but I did spot 2 more errors. So it tried to use return. That one would have been here, right there, return. And so I gave it an example. So on var go sub, and then 100 something, and then you can put return there, 200 do something, return. So that's a legal block of Basic09. You added an extra end if in this block. Yeah, so here's where it was. So this is the code that I got from. I'm not sure exactly which block that was from, but it added an extra end if. This is only an if then. So there's only one end if. So again, for the first error, I asked for a new line for best practices for the if block. Explain what you think has occurred when all their if blocks were written correctly. Place an update to the relevant existing best practices rule, and then regenerate the code. So the new tip, again, that's the one I think is pretty much a copy and paste. This one is an update. So do not use explicit nested end if statements for if else if logic. If each else if is translated to a nested if block, requiring a corresponding end if for proper termination. This can be written a single line for brevity, such as end if / end if. The total number of end if statements must exactly match the number of if statements in the block. And then it said the extra one was added due to misinterpretation of the nested if block logic. The check for $ is part of a single if statement, not a nested one, so it only requires a single end if. My previous response incorrectly assumed a nested if was created. I don't know if that's true or not. Again, one of the things that models are prone to do is to give you an explanation, but it may not actually be accurate. But sure. More importantly, though, was I got a clarified tip that I will bring into my best practices doc, and hopefully prevent such a thing from happening in the future. So again, it generated more. And then I saw a couple of other problems. So the definitions that's referenced in load definitions procedure, it's not handed in as a parameter. So this is another thing that it tends to do. So again, here it refers to definitions, but definitions isn't passed in as a parameter. And that definitions is declared in the main processing, well, in the transpile procedure. So that needs to get passed in as well as def count as well. So same for any other variable sourced from outside of the procedure. So that was the instruction I got. So then it went and made a modification. And here's the load definitions file. So you see it added 3 more parameters. So the definitions, def count, and the flag for verbose logging. So we could pass that through. This was something that I added. I didn't get this to do. I added this as I was sort of troubleshooting. Let me get back to the source code here, and we'll talk about it that way. Transpile.Basic09. So if I go down to the actual transpile procedure, there is. Let me find one of those log lines so I can track down the code. There you go. Verbose logging. Verbose logging. There it is. It's set to true, so it's up here in the flag somewhere. Verbose logging there. So it's to allow. So basically, I've got a flag. I may even change this to some sort of a bytecode, and to have different levels of logging. But this is sort of an attempt at an initial. I want to have a verbose logging so that, and again, when I release the code, I'll hard code that to false, and then I'll add. One of the improvements I want to add is sort of flagging at the parameter call to turn logging level at a specific level, or maybe other configurations as I get into this. So that is a future functionality, and that's basically what this is preparing for. And I have it turned on for true by default right now because I'm still troubleshooting things. So I want nice verbose logs that kind of give me good, at least entry-exit points for key blocks of logic. Okay, so it's just passing that on into the load definition so that I can maintain that logging level across all procedures inside of this module. And then it gave me the block of code to replace all that repetitive logic inside of the main transpile function for loading up the definitions, and it gets replaced with this. So this is another fix. This is where I found the call. So you can see call is thrown on here. I said it's supposed to be run, so it fixed that and gave me an update. And then this is where I found the percentage, percentile, and that's here. Which let me see. While I'm here. Yeah, it's on that one. It must have been when they added in the extra parameters because it passed in by. Yeah. So it's not. It was when I asked it to pass in these values by reference, and because it assumed that everything was passed in by value, it needed to come up with the syntax to do pass by reference, and that's where it invented. Because I said those two need to be passed by reference. That's where the this ampersand symbol came in, and. When I asked it about it, I said, I never gave you instructions regarding using an add as a way to indicate a parameter is being passed by reference. All parameters are passed by, so this is where I clarified it. So in Basic09, all parameters are passed by reference by default. You fake a non-reference parameter by re-evaluating it in line and calling a procedure call, like adding 0 to an integer. So like that, that's my example. Oh, except it shouldn't be called. Interesting. Okay, so, then please provide the tip for this rule. Also, just why this error escaped the don't assume you know how to write Basic09 code rule and provide an improvement. So this is don't use special symbols to pass by reference. Basic09 all parameters. So this is where it gave me that new rule, and this is why it said the error occurred because my previous don't assume rule was good at preventing me from using keywords I hadn't seen like call or nproc, but it wasn't as effective at stopping me from introducing a new pattern. So for instance, that was not present in the reference code. So this is where it gave me an update for that don't assume you know how to write Basic09 code that should hopefully prevent that thing in the future. And then it gave me updated code. And then this is where I caught the load definitions line. So again, it gave me a new best practice for that, and then gave me updated code, and Uh, Interesting. It still didn't fix that, but it did get fixed eventually. So anyway, then I asked for the main processing loop because it never gave me that snippet. So this is the code that actually takes those definitions and then does the logic. And then, oh, this is the labels. That's where I caught the labels. Did I say that up here? Sorry, I'm going back and forth a bit, but I'm trying to remember how this conversation evolved. Oh, no, this is a different error. This is the go to 900, so it was trying to jump between procedures in that call. That's what I caught, and that's where that rule came from. Okay, and then we got the one where we had the issue with the I wanted the main file processing loop to stop using type names, type contents, and that sort of those 6 arrays, and use the definitions instead. So that's what this logic is, and that's where I noted the load def error. So it then gave me a new best practice for that, and then it gave me an update for this where it actually had the error down here, and then it labeled it load def error, but fine, that's fine. But that's where it then came up with end whale. It's only on this one snippet. And I said, where did end whale come from? Why weren't you telling me about a non-reserved word not included in any of the source? Then I said, I apologize for that egregious error. The use of end whale was an oversight on my part, and I should have caught it. The correct keyword to terminate a while loop is end while. The reason this escaped the don't assume rule is that the rule was primarily focused on preventing me from using keywords not present in the reference material or introducing new syntax patterns. It didn't fully account for mistyped or misspelled words that might superficially resemble a correct one. This is a new class of error, and I will update my internal guidelines to be more vigilant about such mistakes. And that's where that new best practice line came in. And then it fixed itself. And then that's where I discovered this new one that I wasn't aware of, where you have, well, I still don't have the type being passed in, but as I was trying to get the code to compile, I can't, and this is where variable and type name must be unique. Trying to use the same name for a type attribute and a separate variable results in a duplicate definition error. This is also why you should avoid single or double letter variable names, even for counters. Variable names should be descriptive, but kept under 10 characters generally, and even shorter for ones that may appear multiple times on the same line of code. Type variables shared to a procedure via parameter passing need the same type declaration at the top of both the caller and called procedures, and type param and dim statements should only appear at the top of the procedure in that order. So that's where we got our new best practices. And so then it talks about where it violated things using some single level variables. And type declaration was only in the transpile function and didn't follow the strict declaration order of type param and dim. So then it updated my code. So now my type is up here, my params are here, and then low definitions procedure, there's that. Full source code all fixed up now. And then the main processing loop snippet of code that I cut and paste in. And then I asked to help rewrite this tip. Oh yeah, and then there was this file input output one was one that was very much specific to this project. So I wanted it reviewed, and this is where I got to do the handling stuff. And the logging I actually promoted to its own level, because logging, I wanted to address logging overall, not just dealing with file I/O. But everything else here is pretty much as you see it. And then that was basically it. So most of the code fixes that I was able to make, I got the model to generate it. At least for the first block of, until I got the code running, it was more about spotting the error and then modifying my instructions. Maybe I did a lot of that first fixing by hand, like hand tweaking, replacing syntax, and fixing errors. But once I got the code running, all of my refactor work was through this conversation. So I don't think I wrote any of the rewrite work. I did code review it, and I tested it and made sure that it operated the same way. But again, even though the code that it was generating had problematic, I was able to get it to fix its code snippets and again beef up my best practices document so that for future conversations I'm hoping I will get a much closer to correct code output whether I'm asking it to generate a snippet or generate a whole procedure or even a series of procedures in the future. So that kind of ends off where I got to this week. It was a long kind of review, but like I said, if you go to my GitHub project, the key files to look at for this week's work is the transpile.b09 file in source.basic under 9 examples. Week 3 will have the specific prompts that I use for both the creation of the initial function and then my sort of refactor work is the update transpiler MD. This calculator specifications one you can pretty much ignore. It was me starting into revising that, but like I said, I've kind of put that to the side for now because next week I'm going to revisit this transpiling process and add some new functionality to it. So just to finish off this presentation, next steps. So like I said, one of the things that I want to add in is the ability to add a flag to set logging levels. I also want to be able to have it transpile a entire folder based on file extension for a given set of definitions, or at least have that as an option. So I could run it off of a single file to replace, or I could have it run off of a batch, in which case I'd need to come up with some sort of common either file name, suffix or prefix, or maybe a different file extension for the post-transpiled Basic09, so the pure Basic09 code. Haven't quite decided on how I'm going to deal with that yet, but it is something I would like to add. As far as the transpiling itself, types I think is working pretty much how I want it. Like I said, it's more about having the single place of definition for a type and then to be able to insert that into any procedure that I want to use it, using just the add type and then the type name. And so that is working fine. Constants, on the other hand, need some rethinking. I still would like to have the ability to declare and set a constant value again across multiple procedures or multiple source files, but I would also like to be able to use that syntax that it wanted to try and do of declaring a new variable, and inside of either the size of the array of the variable or the size of the array of the variable type, to be able to define those as a constant string name, and then have the transpiler look for that and replace it with the actual hard-coded literal value of that constant, so that again I wouldn't have like, again, go back to the original version of this code. In order for this code to work properly, if I wanted to change, where are they? Here, right? So I've got here. So I want to be able to do something like this, where I can put in a max definitions constant of value 50, and then the transpiler will look for max definitions in this specific order, syntax order, so or here, for instance, and replace that string of max definitions with just the number 50. So that's something I'd like to do for next week, is constants. So I'm gonna, that might be a little more complicated, because even if I wanted to define the constant and have that defined as a referenceable variable inside of the file, that's a separate thing than just being able to define a constant and replace it in with a hard-coded number for this type of use. If I want it for both purposes, I might have to alter my syntax slightly, and then I'm also going to have to add functionality to look for this type of a pattern, where it's not going to be looking for at const space max definitions, but I'm still working out how that's going to work. Variables is a similar sort of thing, maybe. Again, it's meant to be for common variables that aren't necessarily being passed back and forth, but I do want to use the same type, like same variable name and the same sort of definition across multiple sources. That's kind of what the variables file is for. But again, I think my over the weekend I'm going to be kind of thinking about what sort of improvements I could do, what additional functionality can I add to both my bash script and this new Basic09 source code. I also want to look at what are the steps I need to do in order to turn this procedure into something that I can pack and deploy into my Nitro OS 9 installation and run at the command line. So those are kind of my initial thoughts of tasks for this week. And we'll see where I get to. If I get all that done, then maybe I'll come back to the calculator if I've got time. But that's kind of the work plan for this coming week. So anyway, thanks for listening to this very long ramble, and I hope the code walkthrough was a lot better than last time. And I hope my camera doesn't obscure as much of what I was talking about. So anyway, thanks again for watching, and we will see you next week.